Hey everybody. Today's topic is 4.2, political processes. And this is, what I mean by this is the political organization of space, results from historical and current processes, events, and ideas. And so all this is saying is, why does the map look like it does? Because of these things. And so this is kind of what we are going for with this unit. Uh, these words that I have in bold are definitions you need to be good with. So explain the processes that have shaped contemporary political geography. And so we'll look at sovereignty, nation states, and self-determination. That's part of this unit, but if that sounds familiar, then it should, because that was actually part of 4.1 as well. So we'll go over that in one slide. And then we'll take a little bit more time going over these four: colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution. We're going to add one more to this devolution when we get there. So anyway, these four are the new things that you'll have to be familiar with. But before we do that, let's review from 4.1. So sovereignty. Remember, sovereignty is the right of a country to rule itself, and so the U.S. can do what it wants. It doesn't. It can't be told by another country what they have to do or what they're not allowed to do. So sovereignty will apply to our country as well as most other countries. All right. A nation state, we've already talked about that. A state which the political and cultural boundaries are generally the same. And remember, these are the two examples to keep in the back of your head because those are the examples that would show up on a test. And so one other thing that I did want to add, when we talk about a nation state, if you look at smaller countries or more isolated countries, they're more likely to be a nation state simply because the smaller they are, the more chance it is that everybody there is culturally similar. The bigger the countries, if you look at the U.S., obviously we are multicultural. The former Soviet Union had a bunch of different ethnicities, and so if you get more isolated, Iceland is very isolated, and so Japan's an island with strict immigration policies, and so those are some of the things that would cause it to be a nation state. And then finally, and I want to focus a little bit more on this one because the definition that I gave you last time, while true, again depends on the scale of analysis. And so when we talk about self-determination, this is people's right to govern themselves. And so when we talk about a country like the U.S., does the U.S. have self-determination? Do the people within the country, let me rephrase that, because when we talk about a government, we're talking about sovereignty and the right to rule. But when we talk about self-determination, it depends on what level we're looking at. And so if you look at the U.S. today, or historically, let me just go back historically, did all of the groups within the U.S. have self-determination, have the right of self-determination? And the clear answer, if you've studied just a little bit of U.S. history, is clearly no. Okay, we've had plenty of groups. If we go all the way back close to the beginning of the founding of the country, but even before that, Jamestown kind of time frame with slavery, that is a blatant disregard for self-determination, right? And so when our country was formed, the voting rights were for rich white males. And so when we talk about self-determination, our country has grown and evolved to bring more people in to have that self-determination. Granting the right to vote is one of those ways to give self-determination. But in other countries, it doesn't work out like that. The governments aren't responsive to different groups of people, and so you might get more violence. People trying to stand up and say, hey, we want to be able to govern ourselves. If there's a sovereign country, if there's a government over top of them that doesn't let them do that and denies them certain rights, then their self-determination is being infringed and they may rise up. And I put this picture here. This doesn't look like a radical, somebody, if I said, hey, picture a radical person in your head, this is probably not the image of somebody that you might pick. But this is one of the more radical people out there who has fought for self-determination, and this is Gandhi, if you're not familiar. And we'll talk about colonization in this video. The British colonized India, and so Gandhi came up early 1900s on up through until 1947 when India got its independence. He fought for self-rule. He fought for the British to leave and the Indian people to be able to rule themselves. He believed that they had a right of self-determination. And so, when we look at sovereignty and self-determination, those two things can sometimes conflict pretty strongly, okay? Because if there's a sovereign nation, and within that sovereign nation, there are different groups that are being repressed that want their own self-determination, then that's when things can get messy, and rightfully so in a lot of instances. If you look at the civil rights movement today in the U.S., the history of the civil rights movement, that was messy. We are better off than we were. We still have ways to go, but that's what we're talking about. So anyway, I just wanted to make clear that there's to beef up this definition of self-determination, not gloss over it, kind of like I did the last time. Alrighty. So when we're talking about contemporary political geography, we're going to look at four things. And another way of saying this is, why do maps change? So if we looked at a global map 100 years ago, it looks a little bit different today. So there's four big reasons that you need to be good with. One of them is colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about colonialism, obviously within colonialism, states have to form a colony. And so these are the ones that we're familiar with. These are the original 13 colonies for the US. And remember, these were not US colonies, they were British colonies. All right. So a colony is legally tied to another state. And by state, remember, we mean like another country. All right. It is not independent. So obviously the 13 colonies were not independent. They were governed somewhat by England. And yeah, so that's what we mean by a colony. And when we have colonization, that's just the establishment of settlements or a lot of other colonies. And the big reasons here, and the biggest one, is this. A lot of it's for economics. Why did these countries? So Spain, this was Spain. Spain came over to this part of the world for God, guns, and glory. That was kind of the rallying cry. Same thing here. They came to Jamestown for the money. They thought there was gold. They did come for religious freedom as well. So this is from England. The blue here is France. Again, we're talking about dollars or whatever, the French franc at that point. And this would be Portugal. And so a lot of this revolves around money. All right. There are political, cultural reasons to do it, but it generally starts with money. All right. And so here's just a couple of examples. Make sure you're familiar with these. Spain colonizing South and Central America. That's the green. So Spain is the green over here. England is the red here. Again, blue is France. We've also got England in South Asia with India. And then we're also going to look at European countries colonizing Africa in this thing called the Berlin Conference, when Africa got broken up and different parts of Europe claimed different parts of Africa. So let's get started. So when we talk about colonialism, this is a cartoon that you might see, political cartoon that you might see in your U.S. history class, but this is kind of the idea. So this is the mother country here. And so keep it in historical context here. So this is England, the mother country, and all of these colonies bring something to her, all right? Whether it's gold and silver, food, raw materials. And so generally speaking, this is also something called mercantilism. This is the economic system that kind of surrounds it, mercantilism that surrounds it. And so the idea is they bring all these raw materials into the mother country. The mother country takes these raw materials, turns them into a finished product, and then sells them to the rest of the world or back to the colonies and makes a whole lot of money. And so the mother country here is getting extremely wealthy. These colonies don't have a choice because remember, they are part of, this would be part of England, wherever the gold and silver was, wherever the food stuff was, that was a colony of England. This is a colony of England. And so you get the idea. The colonialism was established in large part, to spread influence around the world, but really to gain financial power. Okay. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. And so this is what it kind of looked like. This is mercantilism, but this is what colonialism does. And so here we have, again, we're just looking at England, and this went on. A lot of these Western European countries had colonies. And so this is the mother country. They would ship guns, clothing, iron, and beer, so finished products here. They would ship all those out, and they would get all of the resources from North America and Africa. All right. And so you can see this is the Atlantic slave trade. This is what they call the Middle Passage, the trip across. And so that's a terrible part of our history in the U.S. But anyway, so here's all the raw materials. So these are all the colonies over here. They would ship the raw materials back to England. England would take them, convert them into manufactured goods, sell them back across the world. Okay. And real quick, without making this an econ lesson, if you think about coffee, you have the coffee farmer. So let's say that a Starbucks coffee costs $5. Where do you think the majority of that money goes if Starbucks is selling it? All right, Starbucks cup of coffee for $5. The farmer is probably, and I'm making up a number, but I think it's relatively close, might get about 10 cents out of this $5. Okay, most of it goes to Starbucks. And so, kind of the same way, London would be the Starbucks in this scenario, and these colonies would be the farmers. All right, so uh, this is a time frame of colonization starting in 1492. And so you can kind of see here's the different countries that are colonizing. So just wanted to give you a sense. We're going to see colonization over here in the 1500s, 1600s, and then at some point you're going to see it flip over into Africa and Asia. So let me play. This is only a minute long. It's got the dramatic music. We've got the European powers. Oops. So notice, but 1822, this is the U.S. Okay, so the U.S. is now its own power. We've declared our independence, but now you can kind of start to see where England is. England has footholds. Here's Australia. Here's India, and so you can kind of see South Africa. You can kind of start to see where those influences are. And France is obviously expanding. They have some on the coast. All right, and we'll stop it here because the Berlin conference that I'd mentioned earlier, this is what happened. So you can see they took Africa, except for a couple of different small places, and chopped it up and gave it to all these European countries, and that's going to cause problems that we're still seeing today. Notice India. So this is post World War II. That was 1959. So after 1950 or so, we start to see colonialism shrink. Okay, it goes away. We end up with something called neo-colonialism or new colonialism, but which we'll talk about next section. But all right, so you can see it expanded, and now it has come back. All righty. So I just want to give you a kind of a visual of what that looked like. All right. So when we talk about colonialism in Africa, we have this thing called the Berlin Conference, and this is from 1884 and 1885. And this is a phrase I want you to know. It's called the Scramble for Africa. And the European countries got together in Berlin, thus the Berlin Conference, got together, and they carved up in Africa like this. And so the French were the green here, the British are the red, and so you can kind of see how this works. But this is colonialism at its height, to take an entire continent and carve it up and say, okay, you guys get this, you guys get this, you guys get this. And remember, why are they doing this? Okay, and this is why, I'll come back to the other slide in just a minute. Again, a lot of this stuff is all about the money. And so this is a more recent map. And so, petroleum obviously wouldn't have been the big deal back then, but there are, take a look there, gold there, gold there, gold there. And so these are some of the resources that Africa has currently. I mean, uranium obviously wasn't a big deal back then, but you get the idea. They're doing it for the resources. And so if they can go and get the resources from other places, bring them back, turn them into finished goods, sell those finished goods to the world, they become extremely wealthy. And so this is the scramble for Africa is what it's talking about. And so here's one of the problems. When they decided to draw borders in Africa, here's how they did it. And note, and this is where we still see problems today, we have traditional ethnic homelands. All right, and so Africa has a lot of different ethnicities, like all other continents, and so you can see, each area here, like that would be an ethnicity, that's an ethnicity, that's an ethnicity. And so here's one of the problems, that when they drew these lines, they drew them in a very arbitrary way, meaning they didn't take into account where the different ethnicities were. And so if you look at a line like this, I should be in a different color here. I don't know if I can change the color or not. Let's try that. Yeah. So if you look at a line like this, so this was one ethnic group. And so they've taken it and they've cut it up into 1, 2, 3 different places. And now they've put this ethnic group with these other ethnic groups. And so you have these countries that were, the borders were drawn in a very haphazard way without regard to ethnicity of the people that were actually living there. And so now you have multi-ethnic groups, which can cause conflicts. It causes conflicts in all parts of the world, not just Africa, but everywhere. Okay, and so this was a bad idea, is what they would call it. All right. So anyway, oops. Hang on just a second. I'm sorry. Let me get back to that. All right. So anyway, so that's why they did that. Oh, there we go. All right. So when we talk about again colonialism, and again we're trying to look at, you'll learn a lot about this in world and U.S. history, but when we're looking at it in geography, we're looking at why maps change, and this is one of the big reasons. All right. And so why did colonialism end? It was expensive, so a lot of it happened after the end of World War II. England, a lot of these European countries didn't have a whole lot of money after World War II because they spent it all in the war. And so the US, the two big superpowers that came out of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union, they weren't supportive of colonialism. And so it just became politically tough for the European countries to keep those colonies, and it became extremely expensive for European countries to keep those colonies. And a lot of those colonies had strong independence movements, and so a lot of those European countries said, "Forget it, we're done. We're going to drop colonialism for the most part." All right, and so yeah, we'll leave it at that. So here's decolonization in Africa, and so you can see, the years here: 1960, a lot of it happened in 1960, 1951, 56, 64, 75. So most of this, and I do want you to get this year down, these years down, most of this happened between 1950 and 1975. Those were the biggest decolonialization moments. All right. So again, you can just see all the years between those is when most of it happened. All right. So big slide full of words. Let me see if I can cut this down a little bit. And again, this isn't a big part of this. Remember, we're trying to figure out why maps change, but it is important to note, all right, some of the impacts of decolonization. So when the European powers left, and we'll just focus on Africa for right now, when European powers left, when they were there, they did not build a lot of infrastructure except with regard to the export of the raw materials they were there for. All right, and so if we take a country, let's draw a country here. Let's say that they were there for gold, and we had gold mines here and gold mines here, and this was a coast. They would build roads and stuff for here, and they would ship the gold out to the mother country up here. All right, but a lot of this was neglected. Okay, and so they didn't invest in education, they didn't invest in stable governments, they didn't invest in a lot of stuff. They invested in the gold and the ways to get the gold out. And so when they left, remember, these are multi-ethnic groups. So when they left a problem. Okay, they came in, they drew these artificial boundaries, these random boundaries, seemingly, and when they left not much. Okay, and so when we look at countries today in Africa that are having trouble politically, this is one of the reasons. Okay, a lot of states were lacking geographic, linguistic, ethnic, or political affinity, meaning they weren't working together. All right. And so we do end up seeing this thing called the rise of neocolonialism, and we'll talk about that in the next section. Dependency started to show up, a dependency principle, meaning that once these European powers left, a lot of the countries that they left were extremely poor, and so sometimes wealthy countries would loan money to those poor countries, and they would lend them so much that there was no way that those countries could pay them back, and so therefore now the wealthier countries can kind of get what they want, you know. And so it's like if somebody said, "Hey, I'll lend you, $100,000 as a student," you might say, "Hey, this is great. I need this to do X, Y, and Z." And remember, these countries that were left behind, they needed the money to invest in education and infrastructure like roads and hospitals and police force, stuff like that. And it just, they didn't have it, and so they borrowed it. And so, is that reckless borrowing? I would probably argue not, because those are the basic things that societies need. But they borrowed these large sums of money and they couldn't pay it back, and so then they became dependent on the will of those wealthier countries. All right, let's see. One positive side is that a lot of these countries were able to revive their old cultures. Religious ethnic movements facilitated interaction of cultures, and so there was some resurgence or revival of those earlier cultures. We do end up with population resettlements. And so think about what we talked about, the Jewish people in Palestine, and then we'll look at the India-Pakistan border in Kashmir. That's coming up in just a bit. And so you start to see, if when people leave, that stability might leave as well, and then you might have ethnic groups that don't care for each other. When we look at India, after the British left, the Muslims and Hindus in India went after each other in bad ways. So we ended up getting Pakistan and India, and that's something we'll talk about again in just a little bit. But anyway, let me leave it at that because I don't want to go long here. So imperialism is the other thing that another reason for the changing maps. And imperialism is just a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. And so this is the United States. Note the year. We were an imperialist power in the late 1800s. You can see over here we had control of the Philippines here, Hawaii. Let's see, Cuba is down here. Puerto Rico is here. And so, we did extend our influence across the world, much like many of the other countries, U.S. acquisitions and annexation. So you can see this is kind of our imperial time up here. Whoops, 1857 to 1904. And by the way, remember, when we talk about imperial movement, we were the original 13 colonies. This movement this way, part of it. And so this was our expansionary time. This movement started before 1857, but you can kind of see Alaska here, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, countries in Central America, these islands, you get the idea. This is a map of the British Empire and where they were. And again, this is imperialism. So you can see 13 colonies over here, Southern Africa here, Australia over here, India here. All right. And so again, England, big imperialist power. This is the Roman Empire. So this is obviously a lot earlier than this. This wasn't during an imperial time period, but we're getting across the point. I'm trying to get across the point that this is extending through either military or influence a nation's power. All right, and this is the Spanish Empire. So you can see where Spain was as well, and so they had parts of Africa over here, some parts of India here on the coast, and so yeah, you get the idea. And this is the Japanese Empire, same kind of thing. Here's just the country of Japan today, and so you can see that they had influence or control over all those other ones. All right. And some of the impacts of colonialism and imperialism, spread of different languages, spread of different religions, commodity dependence. A commodity is like raw material stuff, that basics that people need for survival for the most part, but or for comfort. Socially, we have a lot of ethnic division, genocide. Genocide is when one group of people gets killed just for who they are, and we might watch a movie on that. And then obviously political, we have different borders, different government systems. And so colonialism and imperialism have kind of these big far-reaching effects. All right, so I mentioned Kashmir. I want to show you the effect. So here we have India and Pakistan. Pakistan used to be part of India, and obviously this is just a small section of India there. But the British controlled all of this and as part of their colonial system. And then when they left, we had this conflict between the Muslims and the Hindus. Muslims ended up in Pakistan, the Hindus in India, but we have this area here called Kashmir. So Let's take a look at this one.
On February 14th, 2019, a suicide bomber attacked a convoy of Indian security forces.
We're getting reports of multiple casualties in a
He killed at least 40 Indian soldiers here in Kashmir.
the deadliest attack the region has seen this century.
The bomber was part of an Islamic militant group based in Pakistan.
Jaish-e-Mohammed claimed responsibility for that attack.
12 days later, India carried out airstrikes in northwestern Pakistan. Then Pakistan shot down at least one Indian aircraft around here. Tensions rose between the two rival nations.
It can escalate.
To escalate.
Serious escalation in years.
Kashmir is one of the most disputed places on Earth. Over the course of 70 years, it's been at the center of 3 wars, fought between 2 massive armies. It's heavily occupied by more than 500,000 Indian troops and a deadly collection of militias and terrorist groups. Kashmir is the stage for the relentless conflict between India and Pakistan. But focusing on these 2 countries can obscure what's really at stake: the voice of Kashmiris who are caught in a vicious cycle of violence.
Whenever there is any conflict between India and Pakistan, Kashmir is always the battleground.
Kashmir is a disputed area. It neither belongs to India nor belongs to Pakistan.
2 giants of nuclear giants, we are nothing in between them.
There is always uncertainty. You never know what is going to happen.
It can be a hartal, it can be a strike, anybody can be killed anytime.
We are the pawns in their hands.
It's a mess. It is a mess, and we have been affected in every possible direct and indirect way.
I have been born in this conflict, and I have to die within this conflict.
Kashmir is one of the most strategic places in the world, where 3 powerful countries collide: India, Pakistan, and China. China invaded and took this slice of Kashmir from India and was given this one by Pakistan. India and Pakistan control these parts, but lay claim to more. This region is at the center of a brutal conflict over these disputed borders, so it's important to start when the borders were being drawn. In the mid-1800s, India was a patchwork of several hundred provinces and princely states under British rule. A century later, when British India won independence, the British left and hastily decided to split the region into 2. These areas would be a new Muslim-majority country, Pakistan, and this would be the mostly Hindu but secular India. The partition was bloody.
Communal hatred flares up in the Punjab. 1 million people become refugees overnight. They flee from savagery and butchery that has never been exceeded, even in India's stormy history.
Amid the chaos, some princely states were given the choice to join either country. In most cases, the ruling monarchs followed the will of their people. But this state, called Jammu and Kashmir, was different. It was right along this new border and had a Muslim-majority population, but was ruled by a Hindu monarch. When asked to pick a side, the ruler chose to stay neutral. Fearing that the monarch would join India, the Kashmiri population rebelled here in 1947. Armed tribesmen from Pakistan soon joined the fight. The monarch turned to India for military help and in exchange agreed to join them, which sparked the First Indo-Pakistan War in Kashmir.
Continuing thus increased the threat to world peace and brought the dispute to the attention of the United Nations.
The UN Security Council brokered a ceasefire in 1949, which established this line, with Pakistan controlling this side and India this one. It also asked Pakistani tribesmen to withdraw and Indian troops to follow so that Kashmir could hold a direct vote to decide its own future. But neither held up their end of the deal. Pakistan argued that Kashmir's Muslim-majority population rightfully belonged with them, while India insisted that Kashmir was handed over to them by the Hindu monarch, so they doubled down and added Kashmir to their constitution. The vote was never held.
I think every person in Kashmir has been affected by India and Pakistan.
The Kashmir is completely destroyed by India as well as by Pakistan.
This is a territorial dispute, they call it. They don't need people.
The main stakeholders are the Kashmiris. Their opinions are not being heard.
Both countries continued to tighten their grip around it for decades.
Kashmir, fighting is going on, and heavy casualties in men and equipment have been inflicted on the aggressor.
In 1965, the Second Indo-Pakistan War broke out in Kashmir. Thousands of people were killed between the huge armies on both sides. A ceasefire ended the war, but didn't change this line. Kashmir was kept divided and occupied. Another war broke out in 1971. This time the focus wasn't in Kashmir, it was in East Pakistan. Here, India helped rebels fight for independence and dealt Pakistan a devastating defeat. This region became a new country, Bangladesh, and Pakistan lost its eastern half. This made Kashmir more important than ever. It became one of the most militarized places on Earth as India and Pakistan deployed planes, tanks, artillery, and soldiers along the line of control. On the political front, in '87, India reportedly rigged an election, declaring a pro-India party as the winner. Now, this was a big turning point for many Kashmiris, who felt they were again denied the chance to vote. Thousands took to the streets in Indian-controlled Kashmir to protest the occupation. But India met the movement for independence with harsh resistance, which quickly escalated to more violence.
In January, security forces opened fire on demonstrating separatists, turning a 2-year-old struggling movement into a full-blown popular uprising. More than 650 people have been killed in clashes between troops and separatists.
Kashmiri militias, like the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, started recruiting Muslim youth to fight for independence, and increasingly attacked the Indian military. Pakistan saw an opportunity in this insurgency. They helped introduce a new kind of militant group, radical Islamic fighters who fought for more pro-Pakistan Kashmir. By the mid-90s, these groups dominated the insurgency. India responded with incredible military force, deploying 500,000 troops to Kashmir, and they cracked down on militants and protesters. Unarmed civilians were killed, and many were forced to flee the violence. And in '98, the stakes were raised yet again.
Today, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests.
Pakistan today successfully conducted 5 nuclear tests.
Kashmir became a battleground between 2 nuclear-armed nations, and another war broke out in 1999.
More evidence of the attacks being launched on the Indian-controlled area of Kargil. The past 2 days have seen some of the fiercest fighting so far. Militant Muslim fighters have also crossed over into some parts of Indian-ruled Kashmir.
The 1999 war ended with another ceasefire, but that didn't stop either country. Over the years, Pakistan's militant groups got bolder and launched terror attacks in and outside of Kashmir. In 2001, members of Lashkar-e-Taiba bombed India's parliament building in New Delhi, killing 14 people. And in 2008, 10 militants from the same group killed 174 people and wounded 300 in Mumbai. Meanwhile, Indian military cracked down in Kashmir, firing bullets and pellets on unarmed protesters, leaving hundreds wounded and blind. This is the vicious cycle of violence. The Indian Army's crackdown drives some Kashmiris to join Pakistani-backed militant groups who carry out violence against the Indian forces. It's a cycle that Kashmiri civilians are stuck in the middle of.
Just because of this conflict, we are losing our young generations because we are getting killed.
Every second day we hear a news that 2 boys were killed, 3 boys were killed, and there is anger, among young generation.
There are psychological effects of the conflict. Okay, everybody is facing some sort of problem in Kashmir.
Hopelessness is everywhere due to this conflict.
When you snatch pens from youth, you are yourself forcing them to pick up guns.
Which brings us back to 2019. The suicide bomber was 19-year-old Adil Ahmed Dar from Pulwama, Kashmir. According to his parents, in 2016, Indian police officers stopped him and humiliated him by forcing his face into the ground. The same year, he was shot in the leg at a protest. The next year, Dar left home with his brothers to join Jaish-e-Mohammed, a Pakistani-supported militia that radicalized him and trained him to be a suicide bomber. A year later, he drove explosives into an Indian military convoy. For more than 70 years, India and Pakistan have driven a cycle of violence, retaliation, and exploitation in Kashmir. But beneath it all is the Kashmiris' wish to make a choice. A wish that continues to be suppressed again and again by violence.
The best way to handle the Kashmir situation is to have a dialogue and to hold a referendum. And both of the countries are not doing anything as such.
In every action, there is equal and opposite reaction. The more suppression you face, the more you rise.
I just want to get a freedom, to get a right to do everything. As a teenager, I have big dreams, but as a Kashmiri, the dreams are suppressed here.
Alrighty. So that one's a bit depressing, quite frankly. So, and again, when we talk about self-determination, that's what we're talking about, the right of the people of Kashmir in this instance to be able to govern themselves. And so they are in a very tough spot. It's not changing right now. So, all right, next one. So we've done colonialism and imperialism. We're also going to look at independence movements. These are, again, things that will change the map. So independence movements, again, fit along with this theme that we were talking about of groups that want to have their own independence. Obviously, it speaks for themselves. And we've talked about Catalonia in the last video. So talked about Catalonia, talked about the Kurds, talked about Taiwan. Today, we're going to talk about Scotland in this instance, and Yugoslavia. Well, we'll talk about all these. Alrighty. So this is trying to read the redrawing of borders. You'll get the idea in just a second.
The number of countries in the United Nations has grown over the decades.
This is about
from 51 states in 1945 to 193 today. Many more places want to become independent, but national governments almost always oppose secession. Catalonia's parliament declared independence from Spain in October 2017, following a referendum deemed illegal by the central authorities in Madrid. Spain dismissed the region's government and decreed that a fresh election should be held. Catalan politicians leading the independence movement could be jailed for decades if found guilty of rebellion and sedition. The autonomous Kurdish region in Iraq also held a recent independence referendum. It outraged the government in Baghdad and neighbouring countries, which also have Kurdish minorities. The Baghdad government claimed the independence referendum was illegal and seized back the lands Kurds had taken beyond their region. The desire for secession is nothing new. There are estimated to be more than 8,000 ethno-cultural groups in the world, with many independence movements demanding their homelands be recognised as countries. Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, said that if every region had its way, the EU would become unmanageable. So who gets to form a state? There are no clear international rules. The 1933 Montevideo Convention declared that a region needs 4 things to become a state: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. But these are only guidelines. Ideally, a region would also meet other conditions, such as show that a clear majority have freely chosen independence, respect its own minorities, have a viable state, and settle terms with the state it leaves and its neighbours. In practice, all of these conditions are hard to meet. Taiwan is a modern, democratic state in all but international law. It's an island off the southeastern coast of China, which has its own constitution, functions as an independent state, has democratically elected leaders, and was the first place in Asia to rule in favour of gay marriage. Per head, it's around 3 times richer than mainland China. But China regards Taiwan as a renegade province. It insists that no country can have diplomatic ties with both itself and Taiwan. Only 19 countries, plus the Vatican, officially recognise it. Somaliland is another region seeking to be recognised as a country. The semi-desert territory on the coast of the Gulf of Aden declared independence from Somalia in 1991. It has its own government, police force, and currency. But no foreign government recognises it. Perhaps for good reason. To recognise Somaliland would encourage other separatists in the region. It would undermine the already weak federal government of Somalia, and it would probably lead to war. There have only been 2 major changes to African borders since the 1960s, and neither is a success story. Eritrea declared independence from Ethiopia in 1993. Today, Eritrea has a despotic government and its people are mired in abject poverty. In 2011, South Sudan seceded from Sudan, making it the world's newest country. Soon after South Sudan formed, civil war broke out, displacing 2.2 million people. Although a ceasefire was signed in 2015, the country lies in ruin, plagued by hyperinflation, famine, and violence. Independence has a romantic ring. Many sympathise with the demand for freedom. But redrawing borders is dangerous and often causes as many problems as it solves.
Alrighty. So when we talk about independence movements, that's kind of where we're going. And kind of the funny thing, when we think about the U.S., there are independence movements within the U.S. There's a group that wants to make Texas independent. There's a group that wants to cut off California and make them independent. There's a group that wants to take the southern state, the southeastern states, make them independent. Tried that once, didn't work out so well. But you know, there's a lot of these different places that are shooting for their own independence. And again, it gets back to the idea of self-determination of a smaller group within a sovereign country, which is trying to get representation for themselves and don't feel that they can. And this is one of the cool things about the U.S. system, the political system, and others. But you know, if there's a group that is being repressed, we do have ways, and it can take a long time, but we do have ways to address that, to try to not get it to where it turns into something like a war. And the Civil War was a failure of that. You know, let's not kid ourselves. You know, we're not great at it, but it does allow us that opportunity to grant people more self-determination. So anyway, the last part, the last one that we're going to look at is this thing called devolution. And so when we talk about devolution, think of the word devolve, to go down, I guess would be one word for it. But so this would be your definition here: the movement of power from a central government to a regional government. So it is, if we have, you know, a big country here and we have different regions like this, you know, let's say these are all different regions. If there's one government here and they say, hey, we have all the power, devolution would say, look, we're going to break up this power and give it to these other regions. Okay. And so it goes down to regional governments within the state, or if devolution gets too bad, it is a breakup of the state itself. And so if devolution went really bad in this country, this little picture country that I drew, balkanization, that's this word here, is when all of these would just declare themselves independent and create their own country. And we're going to look at one or two examples there. So it is propelled by forces that divide and destabilize. These are centrifugal forces, forces that try and divide us apart. Not always like that, but often. Okay, so let's take a look at what devolution is. We're going to look at it in the context of the U.S., but that's not the context we'll use for our tests, but just to give you a sense of what it is. So when we look at devolution, if you look at the U.S. government system and how we've derived power, you know, the government, we have two governments, kind of three, but two, we have a national government, the one in Washington, D.C., and, you know, they have the military, and they make treaties, and they control the currency and all that kind of stuff. But we also have state governments, and state governments have their own power. And so you can see this is a Venn diagram showing the different powers that different entities have. And so state governments have these powers, and national government has these powers. And so, you know, if the national government held all of it, then they said, look, we're going to give these powers down to the states, that would be devolution. Okay, it would be if the federal government said, I mean, let's just pick one of these, and this is going to be a silly example, but you get the idea. So let's say, kind of the more extreme one here, that the U.S. federal government is the only one that can declare war. Okay, Congress has to do it. And so what if they said, we are going to devolve that power, and we're going to send this to the states? Okay, and so now if they said state governments now have the power to declare war, that would be devolution. Okay, it's taking some of these powers and giving it over here. Alrighty. Now, obviously that's a silly example because that would be a bad idea, but coining money, same kind of thing. And so there's reasons that we have that the federal government has power, state governments have power, and then they do have some that they share. These are called concurrent, but you'll learn this in AP Gov. All right, but I did want to show you this because there's actually one more group. All right, and so we've got federal here, and state here, but we also have the local government. And so think about, and this is the one that actually directs us the most, you know, think about what the state, what the local governments do. So if we just look at the local, there'd be this gray area. So like 911, libraries, sports fields, parks, stuff like that, any kind of road projects, some road project, depends on the road. Some are federal, some are state, but garbage pickup, right there, electric, water, natural gas. And so there's some things that just the local governments do, all right? And so on this example, and you would by no means be expected to know all of this, but you kind of get the idea that sometimes federal and local work together, sometimes federal and state work together, sometimes federal, state, and local, so security and roads would be where federal, state, and local governments. So anyway, so again, when we talk about devolution, though, it is the passing down of power from a higher group to a lower group. All right. So let's look at a couple of examples. So this is in Canada. This is Nunavut. I had to look that up. This is Nunavut, a province in Canada here. And so since the 1960s, the federal government has transferred responsibility to territorial governments for matters such as, and so this group in this area called Nunavut has requested more sovereignty or more self-determination for themselves to act as more of a semi-autonomous or autonomous unit. And so these are the things now that the local governments can do. Okay, issues dealing with health, education, social services, housing, and airports. All right. So again, it is the passing from the central government. So the Canadian government, let's just put a big C there, Canadian government, and then they're saying, okay, you guys can do that. All righty. So Scotland is another area that's going through devolution, and they're also one of the independence movements. All right. And so Scotland in 2014, so let's take a look at this map here just so we're all clear. So the United Kingdom, and this stumped me for a long time, but it's really quite simple. So the United Kingdom is made up of 4 different places. We've got Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and Wales. All right, so those 4 places make up the United Kingdom. And so Scotland has been on a drive lately to try to get their independence. So kind of, and I paused there a little bit. If you take a look at this, in 2014, they were allowed to vote whether they wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom or not. And it came back and they said, yes, we want to stay. All right. And so a couple things happened, and we'll get over to this devolution stuff in just a second. So a couple things happened in 2016. There was a vote to leave the European Union, which is, it does good monetary things for countries, but, and that vote's called Brexit, if you've ever heard that term before. And so the UK, and that just was finalized over Christmas break, actually. So anyway, so the United Kingdom left the European Union, and so Scotland's up here saying, wait a minute, we get the European Union, the EU does this pretty well, and so now Scotland is starting to say, hey, we'd like another vote to leave. All right, we want to create our own independent state and be able to join the EU if we want to. All right, so but that hasn't happened yet. All right, so again, that would be a independence movement, but they're not quite there yet. But they have had devolution, and so if you look at this, devolved matters include. So these are all the things that Scotland by themselves can have. They have their own autonomy with. All right, and so agriculture, education, environment, health and social services, housing. You can read all that, and then these are the things that they don't. All right, so this is what the UK government, the British government, would be responsible for. So defense, employment, equal opportunities, foreign policy. You can get all that. And so anyway, so when we talk about devolution, Scotland is experiencing it because they can do some of the things for themselves, but they are an independence movement as well because they're trying to get, again, independence from the United Kingdom. And then the last one we'll look at in terms of devolution, and this is when things get really bad. So the country of Yugoslavia, they were a country in the 1900s, and then they ended up breaking up. And so this red outline was the former Yugoslavia. And so you can see there's a lot of different ethnic groups. So these are all former Yugoslav ethnic groups. And so you can see the problem. right? And so here you have Slovenians up here, Croatians here, Serbians here, kind of mixed in, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, this area here, a lot of different ethnicities there. And so this was one big country, and so you can probably see the problem. The quote from the president, he was there for a long time, Tito, he said, "I'm the leader of one country." See, leader of one country has 2 alphabets, 3 languages, 4 religions, 5 nationalities, 6 republics, surrounded by 7 neighbors in a country that has 8 ethnic minorities. And so, again, you can kind of see what's coming. So I do have, this is our last video for this, and then we're almost done. But this is an explanation of this area. And by the way, we call it balkanization. And I didn't highlight this definition. Balkanization is when a country breaks up completely and there's a formation of newer, smaller states. All right. And so when we look at the former Yugoslavia, which is this whole big thing, they end up breaking up. And so now we have Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro. And so Yugoslavia became these other countries, 6, I think, altogether. So let's take a look real quick, and then we're almost done. 7 minutes on the video.
In 2008, Kosovo became Europe's newest country. This small state of 1.8 million people emerged as a result of one of Europe's most brutal sectarian conflicts since the Second World War. It was a conflict that pitted an authoritarian nationalist leader, Slobodan Milosevic.
When bombing stops, then it will be very easy to continue political process.
Against Western military power.
We must not allow ethnic cleansing or genocide, particularly at the edge of Europe.
Today, Kosovo is peaceful but poor.
Kosovo didn't only transition from war to peace. It was transition now from a communist country to a capitalist one. From a ravaged countryside to the one being rebuilt.
Kosovo was part of Serbia from 1912. Then, in 1918, Serbia became part of what would become Yugoslavia.
Serbs considered and say that Kosovo is their Jerusalem. It was the sort of heart of Serbia.
To this day, Kosovo is still divided along ethnic lines. Over 90% of its population are ethnic Albanians, who are mostly Muslim. Serbs, who are Orthodox Christians, account for about 5%.
This is the southern city of Pristina, capital of Kosovo province.
Throughout the 1980s, Kosovo enjoyed autonomy within Serbia, but the majority ethnic Albanian population wanted more political freedom.
Kosovo Albanian nationalism was growing. There were demands that Kosovo become a republic. Kosovo Serbs began to complain, saying that they were threatened.
But there was one man standing in the way of Kosovo Albanians, Slobodan Milosevic, the leader of the Serbian Communist Party. Milosevic wanted to keep Kosovo as part of Serbia. He rallied the minority Serb population and further divided Kosovo.
Slobodan Milosevic used the Kosovo Serb issue to take power and to play the nationalist card, which was to propel him to full power within Serbia.
In 1989, Milosevic became president of Serbia, and within weeks placed Kosovo back under the direct control of his Serbian government. Petrit Salimi was growing up in Kosovo at the time. He and his family belonged to the ethnic Albanian majority.
When Milosevic came to power, we lost our status. Our political rights were lost, our economic freedoms were lost, and our education rights were lost.
As communism collapsed across Central and Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia began to disintegrate. From 1991, its republics declared independence. Wars broke out in Slovenia, Croatia and Bosnia as ethnic Serbs living in these new countries opposed independence. Milosevic wanted to carve a greater Serbia out of the ruins, so he sent his troops to support Serbs in these conflicts. During this turbulent time, Kosovo's political leadership declared independence too, but this was ignored by Serbia and the international community. In the late 1990s, a guerrilla group, the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA, began to attack Serbian police units. Its aim was to win independence through force.
It was a mixture of excitement, but fear that something big is about to unfold.
Milosevic sent more Serbian security forces into Kosovo to defeat the KLA.
Just a warning here, they are going to show some bodies, some dead bodies, so if you don't want to see that, you can either fast forward or just not watch for just a bit.
The Serbian security forces and the Yugoslav army were pretty brutal. I mean, the KLA was quite brutal as well, but the overwhelming preponderance of force, of course, was on the side of the Serbian security forces.
On January the 15th, 1999, Serb forces attacked the village of Račak, killing 45 Kosovo Albanian civilians.
Račak massacre was a turning point because as soon as the massacre unfolded, people were there, Western journalists, observers, seeing the dead bodies and calling it what it was, a crime against humanity.
As Serbian forces retook territory from the KLA, thousands of Kosovo Albanians fled their homes. The images shocked the West. At a peace conference in France, Western powers gave Serbia and Kosovo Albanians an ultimatum: accept a peace deal or face military action.
We're not interested in a partial agreement. We're interested in a settlement that works.
The Serbs rejected the deal.
We are not talking to Albanians. We are talking to Americans who would like to take our territory for themselves and for NATO. And Albanians were just excuse for that.
NATO resolved to punish Milosevic and his army and began airstrikes on Serb military targets in Kosovo and throughout Serbia itself.
It is about creating the kind of world where an innocent people are not singled out for repression, for expulsion, for destruction, just because of their religious and ethnic heritage.
During the war, my parents, my brother, fled the neighborhood. We were kicked out by the paramilitaries. They were hiding in the forest. I didn't know for several days are they alive or not.
After 78 days of bombing and hundreds of civilian deaths, Serbia capitulated. Milosevic withdrew his forces from Kosovo. NATO tanks rolled in and Petric was reunited with his family. As Kosovo Albanians returned, tens of thousands of ethnic Serbs fled north to Serbia. It would be another 9 years before Kosovo finally declared independence. Today, Kosovo has a rough and ready democracy and a growing economy, but unemployment is high at 33%. In recent years, clashes caused by ethnic tension have erupted on occasions.
Today, most Kosovo Serbs consider themselves citizens of Serbia. They don't recognize the Kosovo state and they don't feel a part of it.
External pressure could improve those strained relations. Both Kosovo and Serbia are working to join the European Union.
I don't think either of us will be able to join the European family until we sort out the issues with each other. Dialogue is the only way we can move forward.
If Kosovo and Serbia are to become EU member states, their governments and peoples will have to work together and bury their bloody past.
Alrighty. So just a couple more examples. Let's take a look real quick. Actually, let me go back. And I wanted to make one point. So we have all these new states. Remember the definition of a state. And by the way, this is showing us where we are in the world. But when we look at these different states, are all of them now nation states? Remember, nation states would say that everybody is really the same culture, same ethnicity, all that kind of stuff. And so when we look at this map, we have Serbs here and Croatians here, so that's not really there, not really there. We just heard about Kosovo, so no there. And so, it looks like Slovenia might be the one that could say, okay, we are close to a nation state, but these other ones have have different ethnicities in them. So that's what this is over here. Let's see. So again, you can see this is Yugoslavia, and then 2006, here's all the other countries. All right, and we did all that. The other example of devolution that I want to make sure you're good with is the Soviet Union. And so this was all of these countries that are in red or light shaded red. This was the Soviet Union. And in 1991, I believe it was, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you ended up with this called the Commonwealth of Independent States. And so again, this is the balkanization of the Soviet Union. And so in light blue back here, the really huge one, this is Russia. And then you have all of these other countries, now states, that were part of the Soviet Union, but because of devolution, the breakup of the Soviet Union, they became their own independent states. Alrighty, so that's the other example. So in summary, told you we'd be close to the end. These are the four things: colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution that cause maps to change. And we're still seeing a lot of that stuff happen today. And then some examples that I want to make sure you're good with. What's going on in Spain, Catalonia, Basque is very similar to what's happening in Catalonia. The Kurds we've talked about, colonization in Africa, Asia, and South America, and really, focus on India here. And then devolution, Yugoslavia, and Soviet Union we've got here, and we'll get more into. There's a whole unit on devolution, so we'll pick up these other ones here as well. So, all righty, I believe that's it. Yep. So, y'all have a great day.